All right, students, the purpose of this screencast is to talk about division by zero specifically. But I thought I would back up just a little bit and talk about the different division approaches. Hopefully you have done the reading in the textbook to introduce all of the approaches to all of the operations. So there are different approaches for addition, there's named approaches for subtraction, multiplication, and division. So we're going to talk about the approaches to division. So hopefully these are familiar to you already. We're going to talk about the sharing approach first, and we're going to take 24 divided by 3 using the sharing approach. And sharing approach I always call apples and buckets. Okay, and this number here is called the dividend. This is the divisor. So in the apples and buckets approach, 24 is the apples, 3 is the buckets. So we have 24 apples. Regretting making the number so big. And we have 3 buckets. So this is, how do I get these apples into the bucket so that I'm sharing them evenly? So it's kind of the one for you, one for you, one for you, kind of the card dealing approach, if you will. All right, so I'm not going to draw all the arrows. So we should be able to know that once I finish that process, I would have 8 apples per bucket. And so my quotient, that's the name of the answer to a division problem, is the number of apples per bucket. Okay. So the next approach here, the book calls it the measurement approach, which I hate because I know it makes students think of number lines, which is a model for arithmetic problems. They call it the measurement approach because essentially you are measuring off groups of size 3. I prefer to call it repeated subtraction, and I'll show you why that is. So I'm going to see if I can get these drawn quickly. All right, so there are my 24 objects, and I am going to form groups of 3, and I want to know how many different groups of 3 I can form. So I'm measuring out groups of size 3. All right, so if you look at this, I was able to form 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 8 groups. So that is my quotient. I call it repeated subtraction because if you are not actually using objects to measure out the groups, you can think of it in a slightly more abstract way, saying, all right, how many times can I remove 3 from 24 before I run out? So you can see what I'm doing is repeatedly subtracting 3 to see just how many groups I can form. And continually running out of room doing so. All right, so I get down to 0. So then I could go back and count. I've got 1, 2, 6, 7, 8. So that tells me, again, my quotient is 8. All right, so finally, the missing factor approach is using multiplication to complete a division problem. And factor is one of the parts of a multiplication problem, so that's where the name of this comes. So essentially I say, hey, I want to know what 24 divided by 3 is. That is the same question as saying what times 3 is 24. So in a multiplication problem, this is called a factor, this is called a factor, and this is called a product. So I can find the quotient of a division problem by turning it into a multiplication problem that's missing a factor. And so, of course, we know the answer to that is 8. Okay, so now we're going to move down and we're going to do division by 0. And, you know, as a math instructor, I find students all the way from, you know, beginning algebra up through calculus often confuse these two problems, 0 divided by 8 or 8 divided by 0. And notice that the number doesn't really matter. It could be 0 over 15,000 and 15,000 over 0. Essentially, it's when the 8 or when the 0 is on the top or the 0 is on the bottom. Now, one of these answers is 0. One of these answers is undefined. I'm going to give you a trick as to remember how to know which one is which, but that's not the important thing here. The important thing is your ability to explain the answers using the approaches, and we'll go over that. So here's my quick, silly way to remember this. So in a problem like 8 over 0, you have the n on the top, and you have the 0 on the bottom. All right, so what does that spell? Well, it spells no. So what that tells you is you cannot actually divide by 0. It's an undefined operation. Don't do it. So that the answer to that is undefined. On the other side of this, you've got 0 on the top, and your number is on the bottom. All right, and what does that spell? Well, that spells on, so I know it's cheesy, but it works. We essentially say, it's on. Go ahead and do the division and get an answer of 0. All right, this should help you remember which is which, but again, what we're going to do right now is the important part. So we're going to start with a missing factor approach. I'm going to go backwards here. So remember what we're doing with this. We're saying, hey, I want to know the quotient to this problem. Right? I'm going to turn it into a matching multiplication problem instead. So I'm going to say, what number times 8 is equal to 0? And the answer to that, of course, is 0. So using the missing factor approach, it makes perfect sense why 0 divided by 8 is 0. And I'm going to do it the other direction. So I'm going to say, hey, some number times 0 is equal to 8. And what is that number? Well, anytime you multiply by 0, you're going to get an answer of 0. So this is impossible. Or you could say no such number. So here's where undefined comes in. Okay, hopefully this is making some sense to you. All right, let's jump over here and do the sharing approach. So apples and buckets, remember. Here's my apples. Here's my buckets. So no apples, 8 buckets. Right? And I'm essentially saying, all right, I need to share these apples evenly into the buckets. I'm done, right? If there's none to share, I don't really have any work to do, but I can give an answer. Because remember, the quotient is the number of apples per bucket, and that is 0. So there's where my 0 answer comes from. Now, on this problem, apples and buckets switch positions here, right? So now I've got 8 apples, and I've got 0 buckets. All right, 0 buckets, so I'm not drawing anything. And my job is to share the 8 apples evenly into, okay, well, I don't have buckets. So I can't perform the task that I'm being asked to perform. If there's no buckets, I can't share them. So I can't share into no buckets. So here's where, again, I'm saying I can't even do this operation. It's an undefined operation when you're trying to divide by 0. All right, so one more time here. So we're going to do measurement approach, repeated subtraction. So I'm going to look at it as, hey, I've got 0 objects. I'm making groups of 8. So how many groups of 8 can I make? And there is an answer to this question. I have 0 objects. How many groups of 8 can I make? I can't make any. So I do have an answer of 0. On this one, I have how many groups of 0? And so if you think about it, kind of remember what I was doing on the last one where I did 24 minus 3 and got 18, and 18 minus 3 and got 15, and so on. If I start with 8 and I subtract 0, I get 8, and I subtract 0, and I get 8, and I subtract 0, and I get 8. So there's no way I'm ever going to finish this. So if I'm saying how many groups of 0 can I get, I can't get an answer to it. I can subtract 0 from 8 for the rest of my life, and I'm never going to run out of objects. So again, we have this situation where we say division by 0 is undefined. That's it. I hope this helped you with both approaches to division as well as division by 0. You need to be prepared to be able to explain division by 0 using all 3 of these approaches.